Hello and welcome everyone to this week's episode of the Framework Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Hopkins, and today I'm joined by somebody who I really just got to talk to for the first time just yesterday in person, even though we're connected on social. So I'm joined with Dr. Lere. So I'm really excited to have you on here today and learn more about your story. I've been watching your stuff from afar. I love some of your social and other content you're putting out there. And so this is going to be fun for me too, as that all the listeners we're learning together this time. So it's awesome.
Well, it's great to be here with you, Jamie. Thank you.
Well, one of the first things is for people who may or may not know you, tell us real quick, like the 30 to 60 seconds, who you are, what you do, and then we will get into your story, but we'll start there.
Absolutely. I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I have a practice outside of Napa, California. It's hideous here. My husband is in the military, so this is where we're stationed right now. And I tell people I have one of the best jobs in the world. There's not a single week that goes by that I don't come out of a session or a day thinking, I can't believe I get to do this. And how I describe my work is this: I get to sit behind closed doors with bright, accomplished, intellectually curious, driven people all day long and have the conversations with them that they are not having with anyone else in their life. And that is an absolute privilege.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to describe it too. I love that. And I hope everyone feels that they have the best job in the world too. They might not be in as desirable as locations. So I love Napa. I haven't been in a while now, but that's where we did our honeymoon. We went to Napa, and obviously stayed in Yountville, and absolutely positive memories of that whole experience. It was wonderful. And
Fabulous.
I've got a couple friends that live out there too, so it's a lovely place. And then one of our opening questions I usually ask people here, kind of as an icebreaker, is a favorite thing about food, or and it's very broad. Like, I don't just care what your last meal would be, but if it's culturally, and that's the amazing thing about food, it's everyone's different with it. Obviously Napa, is known for wine and has fantastic food, but love to hear, what is it about food that's important to you, or your last meal, favorite meal, what you're making, anything that comes to you when you hear food.
Well, Chef Lauren would be proud of me. I am a lover of all things vegetable. But when you put that question out there, the first thing that came to my mind is my lifelong love for dill pickles and olives. So
Okay.
give me all of the olives and dill pickles all day long. So when I was little, my grandmother I grew up in the Midwest, so we would have what we called a relish tray out at holiday meals with the black olives from the can and the dill pickles. They could not put that on the table until it was time to eat, or I would take care of the whole thing for everyone.
Yeah. Funny enough, olives. I don't think we've had anyone on the show yet that's said olives. Not that I remember, at least, but my memory isn't as good as it once was. And pickles, though, yes, Chef Lauren's first story started with pickles too, and the sub shop she used to go to. So I love whenever we get a Chef Lauren reference on the show. Sonia Dreisler, who's not too far from you either, she's a also would be very happy. She loves all the vegetables out there too. So we got two people. And then Tony Stick and Tyrone have more infamous arguments about pickles. So we've got at least a couple ties here that are all in the food world, which is fun. And so where in the Midwest did you said you started in the Midwest? Obviously, we'll get to your story of moving around a lot, but where are you from?
So I was originally born and raised in Minnesota. So I grew up about an hour and a half west of Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Yeah, and I heard a little bit, right? I think you were talking to the producer Broderick about the asking your dad like, why are we living here or something?
I was explaining. So I was explaining to him that I love so many things about California. And I absolutely love the climate here. Give me dry heat all day long. So as a little girl in the freezing, frigid cold of Minnesota, I would say to my dad, why do we live here? Why would anyone live in a place like this? And the answer I always got was, well, this is where our ancestors settled. And I told him, even as a little girl, that is not a good enough reason for me to stay. So, and here I am.
Yeah, that it's a I love my Minnesota people, so yeah, it's probably not for me to live there full time throughout the year, but I used to do a lot of work with Thrivent, and they're based out of there, and
Yeah.
they would bring us at the best time of the year too, like almost every year. Right in that first week of March, they'd bring you out, and you're like, "Hey, it's the best time to see downtown Minneapolis because everything's frozen over. It's been negative degrees for 30 days, and
So
it's
it's
a wonderful
still,
time."
March is still a gamble for a blizzard. So you never
Mhm.
know. So
Yeah.
you got lucky.
Yeah, I've definitely been there in the some nice snowstorms. And food there though, I do like that. So I'm a big cheeseburger person, and so then Minneapolis is known for the Juicy Lucy.
You
So
Lucy.
yeah, it's a very
Absolutely.
good burger. So, well, now, taking another step into our other icebreaker question, I've been asking people this, and you probably are usually on the other side of this, asking people, which is, what's your first experience with money? That first money memory, positive, negative, from trauma, good, bad, whatever it might be, and what comes to mind there?
My earliest money memory is as a little girl, I had three yellow margarine containers. They, we did not buy, I can't believe it's not butter. We inherited these. They were passed down to our family from my grandparents who would buy the upscale margarine, and my mom would use them my mom is a fabulous cook, and she would freeze things and make everything from scratch. So she wanted all of these containers from everyone. But I had these three yellow containers, and there was masking tape on top of each one. And one said save, one said spend, and one said give. So some of my earliest memory is carrying this little yellow margarine container in with me to church with my money to give.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so that's a great way to kind of teach money too. It's just did somebody like was your family trying to instill that through that? Was that the goal or yeah.
I I was very, very fortunate that my parents were very intentional about scaffolding financial literacy in me early on. So I don't ever, it's hard for me to have a pre-awareness of money memory that goes back very early for me. My parents grew up I grew up on a family farm. I was born in the 80s. It was a horrible time. My parents were early on in their farming career, like hemorrhaging money. So I grew up in that context of like this is kind of survival mode. So I was always very conscious of that. I as a psychologist recognize the impact of the financial homes we are raised in and how we carry that forward and are shaped by that. So I recognize that even in my someone like my mom, who was raised by parents who had lived through the depression. So my mom would always repeat to me something that my grandmother would tell her: just because they have it doesn't mean they can afford it. So I was getting those messages early on. We there was a I have kind of traditional Midwestern work ethic. That's something that was instilled to me very early on. I knew another thing about growing up in Minnesota, I knew early on manual labor was not for me while I was picking rocks in the field. but I, but I, so work has been something that I was taught to love, that it's not something to dread, it's meaning, it's purpose, and it's been a part of my life my whole life. And I see that as a way of really impacting the world. I also feel very fortunate that my parents were very intentional about teaching me about investing early on. So that's something I was interested in and able to start even as a teenager. So that's a little bit of my kind of financial background in terms of my personal history.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You know, I grew up in Baltimore, and so we didn't have as many like farming stories growing up, right? So like learning about like agriculture has been, now Maryland and all states have it, but like Baltimore is not really, like I didn't know other farmers growing up,
Right.
and uh my wife's parents, they live on a farm, still own the family farm. Ron Carson, our CEO, has a similar like kind of impact on money, where he was in college then, so a little bit older than you and I. But right, parents were running a farm in the 80s during that same kind of farming crisis in the country, and that shaped really his entire career and shifted him from wherever he was going to go into financial services, because he was like, I need to go figure out the right thing. And he read a money magazine thing that said become a CFP, and on he went. And it's interesting, right, how that farming also shaped a lot of yours. Did they make it through that? Did they keep the farm? Did they keep doing it? Or
Yes, my father still owns the farm today. It was no longer a livestock operation, but he's continued to hold the family land. You're talking about that made me think about, I have memories of growing up. I was always, so most kids don't understand how the global economy and whether how some place can have a knockdown, this wild domino effect. My parents were often talking every day within earshot about the timing of selling and trading and watching what the weather was doing in Argentina and so all of these different parts of the world. So I understood, I maybe didn't have the framework to understand what the lines were, but I knew if there was something not great going on in China, it was going to impact mom and dad's mood.
yeah, that's pretty cool. So, what is it? Trading places. I think that's the first memory I have of that type of thing too. So there's the movie, right? And I forget what they're trading, maybe oranges or something at the end, and that's the stock market play. And it's like what's happening out there in the world. And so, yeah, it's an interesting tie to things. So yeah, let's I guess start kind of walking now through some of your journey and your story. So we've gotten some background, but when does the, I guess, when do you start getting this notion of like clinical psychology, behavior, working with people? When does that start to develop? And, when do you start kind of looking at that as a career? And yeah, so I'd love to hear about that.
Absolutely. So, as an undergrad, I studied communication and PR, biblical studies, theater, and psychology. So, it was a very interesting fusion. And I was wanting to be thoughtful and strategic because knew at one point in college that I was going to have the opportunity to marry up and become the wife of the man who's now my husband. Um, and I knew that signing up for being Mrs. Lere meant that I would be signing up for life as a military spouse. So I had to be thoughtful about that occupationally. So I wanted to leave my options open, and I after I finished undergrad in Minnesota, I spent a year working in Boulder while my husband finished up ROTC at CU. And I worked in event management, and that was great. But at that point, I was really itching to go back to school. And our first assignment was actually in the UK. So we spent several years living in the UK, and that's where I first began my clinical career. So I was able to get my master's while we were there, and I fell in love with clinical work. I had the opportunity to work on the economy. So I opted to not stay with kind of the familiar US based practicum options. I'm like, I'm going to go out and find myself a job in this new country and be exposed. So I was able to work within their healthcare system and turn a job into that first clinical experience I needed. So I got to the end of my master's, and I knew I wanted more. I was still like hungry for academia. And I think I had reached this point of the more you know you don't know. So I really wanted to have more depth to my clinical work, practice, and understanding. So while my husband was in Iraq through a fortuitous series of events, it worked out that I was able to be accepted to a PsyD program at George Washington University, and we managed to get an assignment in DC. So I moved myself
Mhm.
back across the ocean and started school, and then he joined me shortly thereafter. And that's where I did my clinical training in DC, and then I matched to a program for my pre-doc internship up in Princeton, and then moved back to DC. And and then I worked at a fabulous group practice there. And that's where I was before making the leap over to the left coast here in California.
Were you in the Princeton healthcare system when you went up to Princeton? Okay, very nice. Yeah, one of my I've actually have two good friends that have you've been on the like fundraising side for Princeton healthcare
Oh,
system. So
interesting. Interesting.
yeah, oddly enough, like if people need help in that space, I know people. It's like, but yeah, so we live not too far from there, but I love Princeton area. I think it's gorgeous and
A wonderful, wonderful place.
yeah, and then DC is close to my heart. I grew up in Baltimore, and then parents moved a little bit further in between the two. And then I my first real job out of college was in DC, so I spent some time there and have a lot of friends that are in the DC area. I went to Davidson, and so a lot of people, yes, the DC and Charlotte are really the two draws from Davidson.
Mhm.
So we end up in both places a lot, but I think the next story is kind of tying to this profession of the financial service one. I want to make sure we get to this one as part of the journey. And so you start off right with this. Well, obviously, you already had this money impact, and you've got the psychology, you've got the academia part, and you've traveled around a little bit. And so, when did all of a sudden you say, "How do I start putting the two of these things together here too?"
Well, there are a couple of layers to this. So I'm going to start with, something have observed as I zoom out over the last decade, more than a decade of clinical practice, is regardless of what presenting concern is. So that's kind of shrink speak for what is the reason someone starts therapy. And often that's symptoms, and really symptoms are just kind of signals of other stuff. But regardless of what that was, as people came in, started sharing with me their stories, talking about their lives, in some way, shape, or form, almost always money becomes part of the picture, because money is this thing on this canvas on which someone's personality is splashed, and it's a very personal thing. It is a very intimate thing. I tell people will come in and talk with me and tell me all the gory details of their sex lives. And if I start asking them about their salary, they like shrink back, like, how dare you have the audacity to ask me that? So those are the kinds of conversations that kind of get brought in and are, you know, I work with people to address issues about, okay, are you underemployed? Are you creating your own, unwillingly creating your own glass ceiling for yourself in some ways? So, and obviously, well, not obviously, but often when working with couples, why are you coming in? Are you fighting about sex or are you fighting about money? And then we get to what's underneath that. So money was this theme that really stood out to me. So I worked at a practice in DC, and I had a colleague named Dave who will remain my entire life just a dear friend. And he would say he knew that I was really fired up about business and finance and those kinds of things. And he would always say to me, I went to grad school with this guy. You really remind me of him. He does stuff with people and money. He doesn't do therapy anymore, but he does some stuff. So there was always this guy who did stuff with people and money. Well, that guy who does stuff with people and money happened to be Daniel Crosby. So my friend Dave introduced Daniel and I, and we became fast friends. And everyone who knows Daniel just knows his heart and generosity. And we had some great conversations, and he shared with me, finance is a space where maybe we could use another psychologist. And certainly there are very few voices in this industry that are female. So if you want to come over to the party, here's an invite in. And it has been, and since I've stepped into this space, I've just, one of the things that I have loved so much is the opportunity to do what I'm doing here with you. Just meet such incredible, brilliant, caring, compassionate people in this community. And so it's a joy to be here. I think I'm really excited about what's happening within the finance industry, where more and more people are acknowledging and legitimizing, like, money is a mental game. This is not it. Economic theory is insufficient for understanding and really truly helping people. So I'm really excited about the future of behavioral finance. And also it's really an honor and privilege as I get to know people and get to hear their stories. The truth is, at the end of the day, we're all humans, and everyone even working within this industry, especially this last year, everyone has been a human in a pandemic. Now, people in this industry have been a human in a pandemic, in an industry that has faced incredible stress and pressure. So really then helping support people with, okay, how do you show up as your best, most self-aware self, is something that I love. That's part of what I'm getting to do now.
You brought up just a couple things that my mind always wants to go in a couple areas. I'll work backwards. So like pandemic wise, obviously that's just a timely topic. I mean, have you seen significant like behavior changes, people more stressed? I mean, I think some of those are somewhat obvious, but is there anything that you think is like you've noticed from like the psychology side that surprised you about the last year, or something people aren't as aware of? Yeah, really any insights?
So I was having a conversation with a friend the other day and explaining, when anyone has to do any kind of research within an institution to see what happens when, you have to go through this process called an institutional review board. And that's it, set in place to make sure that people or animals are not harmed in the midst of this experiment. If 2020 had been an experiment, it would have never passed any IRB. The things that people have faced, the stressors have really been tremendous. And I've seen a couple of trends. I think for people who've had maybe pre-existing issues and concerns, this in some ways was an accelerant that was dumped on top of that. So in some ways that's maybe amplified symptoms or brought up things that were previously resolved that have popped back up. And I think for other people, just because of a lot of life changes, it's maybe stripped away and revealed things or problems that were already there. But now they're having to take an honest look at. I do think overall there certainly has been an uptick in depressive and anxiety symptoms for a lot of people across the board. You know, we as humans, when we are under stress, we naturally regress. So the things that people reach to kind of medicate and manage that stress, we've got substances, food, those kinds of things have become even more problematic or started to be problems for some people. And I think another dimension coming out of this is thinking about the relational and social impact on people. There were a lot of changes that households faced as people were all of a sudden together all the time. So I think people learned a lot about their relationships and their partners, and that created a lot of stress. And then we have the social isolation piece. You know, there's power in human connection. So I think, and I really believe that we can't even see and understand today, right now in January 2021, what some of the knock-on effects are. I really believe in resilience of the human spirit, but we will see what the true fallout is in so many ways, psychologically, economically, as it's a little bit of a wait and see.
Yeah, and that stuff's really interesting because you know, psychologists, I was talking to Dr. Brad Klontz recently too, and he was talking, and we kind of got to this, like, the butterfly effect of behavior, and how literally, right, the depression era conversations are impacting like how we're dealing with money today, because it impacted our parents who then impacted us. And so it is really interesting, and like I try to think about like what ways will people act differently coming out of this, and we don't know yet. But you know, I think about like my kids. I've got 3 young kids, which we've talked about before. And you know, my daughter now is 4, and she is like totally used to wearing a mask, right? It's like a normal part of life for her now. And so now she's picked out, right, different styles of masks. So she's got her like Frozen mask with Anna and Elsa on them. And like all of a sudden, like, how does that impact, right, like just the way she perceives things moving forward? Like, it will be odd to her in like whatever time period when everyone doesn't have masks anymore. So it, to me, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like I don't leave the house much, so I'm never wearing a mask. Whereas like lots of people have to have them on for longer periods of time. And like she'll remind me, like she does mask check in the car when I'm driving her to daycare, because like I don't have it on. I have already put it on her. And she's like, Dad, mask check. And I'm like, my mask. So it's interesting. kind of, yeah. And I think you're right. Like it's the wait and see, like what types of behaviors will we see modified coming out of this,
Mhm.
long term or short term. I did have a question too about like psychologists and money. So I've heard other psychologists and doctors and other people talk about that. They tend to struggle kind of with their own conversations with money. And so, how have you seen that among like peers? Like, how many like openly address this, or do they also right? Like, we're talking like I'm fine talking about your sex life, but now we're talking about your compensation. Well, I don't want to talk about mine either. So,
So with and and this is a huge topic that I have lots of energy about. So going back to my experience at this practice, I think one of the things I am will be forever grateful for was the person I worked for, because I really learned from him, and he modeled for me that in any industry, if you are running a business, it's not enough to be good at your craft. So Aaron Giordini is an exceptional clinician, and he also has incredible business prowess. So I was able to see both of those things alongside of each other. So I really internalized a lot from him. I learned just to, because this is not something that is taught or talked about in graduate training at all for psychologists. So I feel very fortunate, similar to growing up, that early in my career, I then had that scaffolding and understanding. And I was able to, in therapy, it's like time. It's a boundary issue. So when someone is late on a bill or those kinds of things, okay, that's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but we need to talk about it, because if something is happening in therapy, it's probably happening in other places in your life. And I just wrote a piece on how to find a therapist and things to look for and things to consider. These boundary issues, they should be talked about. And if uncomfortable, courageous conversations can't happen in therapy, where can they happen? And I do see a lot of therapists struggle with this, and 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 the ones that don't, I think that's a reflection of, okay, you've sorted your own stuff out about it, so it's not getting in the way of the work. And I think that is what is so important. Yes, a clinician needs to have their own sense of financial confidence and security. Then to, in some ways, I see myself, I need to model confidence and assertiveness around this area, because a lot of people don't have positive financial role models, especially women. So that is something that that is really important to me, and I'd like to think about it that way. We are not helping people in our lives, if it's about money, if it's about anything, if we give them a pass on hard conversations, because that is then just enabling behavior that in a lot of ways is limiting to them. And I think sometimes in a profession like psychology, there's this, well, I just want to help people. And no, you don't want your clients in their lives to undervalue themselves or give themselves away. So why would you model that as a clinician in terms of undervaluing your time and those kinds of things? So I actually think there's a lot of powerful lessons there, but it requires for clinicians to have some learning and understanding of that, and then bringing that to the table with some confidence.
you've kind of talked around this one topic. I use slightly different terminology, but you talked about kind of underemployed or undervalued, and it's kind of that human capital conversation about like what's your worth, what's your ability to earn. Is that a topic you see a lot of, like, misalignment, I guess, in people? I don't know what right terminology there is either, but where they are undervaluing themselves and their careers and putting, you said, creating their own glass ceilings for themselves.
Yes, that's something I see a lot. And when I think about what I do as a clinician and with clients, oftentimes if we think about the zero to one concept, sometimes people are coming in with symptoms, and they're at -1, and they're thinking, I just need to get to zero, like I am suffering. But what I love is helping people in their lives get from 0 to 1, and really looking at, okay, how do I up level my life in all spheres, and in what ways am I limiting myself knowingly or unknowingly from doing that. And I think people do that a lot professionally. It has to do with confidence, and a lot of it has to do with confidence and self-esteem issues. Like, do you believe you are worth this? And I think a lot of people are very risk averse, so they stay where it's safe and comfortable, and they aren't willing to take the leap. So a lot of times I'm encouraging people, take the leap, reminding them, if you are promised to know if you aren't asking the questions. And it's I love people. I work with a lot of people just doing long-term depth psychology, and I have cases where I've seen people like climb out of underemployment and really be thriving. And like that, those are the sessions I come out and I'm like, I can't believe I got to be an audience to that in someone's life.
A- And so when somebody moves kind of, as you said, from that pain to actually succeeding, I mean, what is the kind of some of the triggers or movement for change, right? Like, because it's kind of the natural, right? Something in motion stays in motion, something that's not moving doesn't move. And so what actually causes people a lot of times to make these changes, whether it's about their careers, their family, their relationships, their health? What do you kind of see there, or what does the research suggest too, right? On actually getting people to move.
So a couple thoughts about this. I think the first thing is, change is internal. Change cannot be forced for someone. In the therapy room, I can't want something for someone more than they want it for themselves. And I see this in families, I see it in couples. You know, if if someone is in treatment and they don't want to be there, like, they are wasting their time and money until you are ready. And for some people, they reach this point of, okay, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, and now I'm willing to change. And for some people, that takes a lot of time and a lot of pain. Others, not so much. Also, I think there's a model of change that I think is really useful to think about too. It was put together by two brilliant guys, Prochaska and De Clemente, and they talk about how we go through stages of kind of pre-contemplation, where we don't even see, like, there's nothing I need to change. Sometimes people are in denial, or they just aren't seeing something, to maybe preparation and starting to kind of flirt with that idea of, okay, maybe I need to make some change. What would that look like? I'm not ready to go there, but maybe that's the direction I want to head. And then moving more towards the action steps. What do I need to do to, like, make this happen? And then when the changes are in place, then what do I need to do to now hold on to the gains that I have in more of a maintenance mode? And I think another thing that's important to understand about change is, it's similar to what you said. We when an object is at rest, it wants to stay at rest. When something is moving, it wants to keep going. And a lot of times this is really complex within systems. So a system is any kind of group. That can be a couple, it can be a family, it can be an organization. And oftentimes a whole group doesn't decide they want to change or make the same changes at the same time with the same resolve. So oftentimes you will see one person start to make changes, and the rest of that system, consciously and unconsciously, doesn't like that equilibrium was upset. So then they really try to pull that person back into that old familiar role, because humans prefer what is familiar, even if it is unhealthy or toxic, over what is new and different and uncomfortable. So part of sometimes the work with therapy is helping someone like really stick that landing and stay there, even though there are a lot of forces in their life trying to pull them back. And over time, what's exciting is sometimes then the system is forced to respond. So I'll be working with one member of a couple, and after a long time, the partner sees, okay, my wife is showing up different. Maybe I want and need some of that for myself. And that is where you see more systemic change. But human change is a really complex process.
So I think that brings up a really good topic for our audience too. So for leaders, right? So you're a leader and you decide you want to change a direction or something of a firm, which is kind of like changing a system. What is it that helps create success there? Because I absolutely, see that firm leaders and sometimes more division leaders, team leaders come in, here's the new idea. And right, if the resolve isn't there from that person, there can be pullback from the team that says, well, but we've done it this way, and I think this works. And all of a sudden, the change doesn't happen, or the change doesn't get the support it needs. So it kind of falls apart. And then people are like, I told you that wasn't going to work. And you're like, yeah, but nobody actually like it. We're not actually sure it didn't work because nobody ever bought into it.
Exactly. So I've done a lot of work and consulting with the Department of Defense. So this is something I see a lot within military leadership, and it depends upon what the change is. But I think there are some kinds of changes that the most powerful impact is when it happens from the top down. So maybe a leader introduces a concept or something he or she wants to see practice. Okay, you need to start modeling that. You need to do that first rather than being prescriptive. Sometimes that in and of itself can lead to some powerful change for a group or system.
And that ties in my mind to like one of the things you said earlier, which was also from psychologists, being confident about your own money conversations, so then you can kind of instill that. I mean, do you think that's part of the same, like, would you think that same type of philosophy of leading around actions would transition to like working with clients from like a financial advisor standpoint?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think whenever you are working and there's a power differential, or you are in a place of giving advice, there's a lot of power in practicing what you preach. And I think holding on to that is really important, because then you can draw from your own experience, and people pay attention. They notice what we do. They may not say it, but people notice far more than we give them credit for. And if you think about how you really develop trust in a relationship, if there is a discrepancy between what someone is saying and how they are showing up, that's going to erode trust. And if you think about that from a business, eh, from a business vantage point, like, you are shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, and trust obviously probably comes out as a great topic. How do you and can you rebuild trust once it's broken, right? Because there's a lot of sayings about, right, it takes forever to build trust and seconds to destroy it. But obviously, people who come into probably consultations and working with you, a lot of them probably are there because some level of trust has been broken and it's an attempt to rebuild.
Yeah.
So like is it, can you do it?
Absolutely. But it takes time. And that's something I talk with people about early on. And I can actually learn a lot about someone based on how their level of trust with me early on. If they are very skeptical, or if they are indiscriminately trusting. Because if we look at that continuum, if that is happening outside in their life, then it can cause problems on both ends. They can be opening themselves up to something without knowing what they are walking into, or they can stay closed off from incredible opportunities that can come if there's some level of vulnerability. So I say to people, I you don't know me from anyone walking off the street. I don't expect you to trust me. This is going to take time. There Someone isn't going to tell me everything about themselves or their life in those earliest stages of treatment. Like, it just doesn't work that way in human relationships. So it does take time, and again, going back to, people pay attention to what you do. So you have to be consistent. You need to have integrity. Those You can't move forward and deepen and strengthen and move up in your relationships without those things.
Yeah, I think I'm on the far too trusting side of the spectrum. That's what I was thinking about when you were saying that. I was like, well, where do I rank myself on this spectrum? I know kind of time wise, that's my job. My only job here is to keep us kind of moving through topics. So the third piece is really, what's the impact that you want to have, right? Like, when you look out and you're, kind of bridging two fields now, what's the impact that, in the future you look back and say, I did a good job, right? Like I made whatever meaningful impact I wanted to have.
I think going back to really helping people up level their lives in all spheres. So their increased emotional awareness, having healthier relationships, and getting uninhibited about financial success and understanding that. All of these important buckets in our lives, creating meaning, spirituality, like, we are holistic human beings. And I think that is really important to me. And I think how we do that is this: it's really becoming and really intentional in your life. There it's a little bit stoic, and I think sometimes people kind of brush it off, but there's incredible power when you approach your life, when you approach your work, like, this is bonus rounds. What if I was living on borrowed time? My experiences in my own life and within the military, like, I understand we are not promised anything beyond what we have right now. So you need to make it count. And I think when people start approaching all areas of their lives, their health, their relationships, their finances with that level of intention, it unlocks incredible success.
And what would you kind of tell a business owner, advisor, somebody out there, or any listener, right? Like, what's probably one of the more powerful things from what we've learned about, or you've learned about psychology and people's behavior from money, that they should try to kind of instill in the framework of their own life today? Like, what's the big lesson?
I'm going to bring it back to self-awareness. I think there are a lot of knowing yourself is so important. And I think part of that is then becoming more well versed and more used to paying attention to what information are my emotions giving me and using that intelligibly. And there's a lot encapsulated in self-awareness, but I think if you understand a little bit more about why you do what you do, you can then bring more intention to asking yourself questions. Well, is this working for me? Is this the way I want to keep doing it? Is this going to help me get to where I say I want to go? And if it's not, then you've done some of the work to understand, okay, maybe there are some shifts and changes that need to happen so that I can then bridge the gap between where I am and where I really want to be.
And since it did come to self-awareness, and I've been asking some of our behavioral finance experts this, so I think it's fair game now. What's the probably biggest psychological or mental or behavioral hurdle with money that you've had to overcome?
Ooh, what a great question. Um, I I'm going to sit with this and not jump to that. I think I think when we think about kind of action by, like, I'm like everybody else. Sometimes I need reminders. No, you need to stay in your seat and think about that. And then alongside of that is this idea that, you know, we as humans, we like to think that the way things are now is the way they will always be. And maybe that's the biggest one. I think the importance of being able to zoom out and really move back and hold on to the big picture, not just the numbers right in front of you. I know for me that's one of the most important things, and that probably impacts me the most emotionally when I get too dialed into, well, this is what it is right now.
Yeah, that kind of narrow focus aspect, right? We get really focused on what's in front of us and we're not seeing everything else. And to some degree, it's how I react to bigger picture stress points, right? So like if I'm having a lot of stress over things I can't control, what do I do is I focus on like smaller things that probably aren't very important, but like I can tell that like I'm hyper focused on like a word in an article, and I'm like, well, that's the wrong word to use, and I'm all upset about some word, and I realize that it probably has nothing to do with the word they used in an
We
article.
place the anxiety on bigger things, and I think that has happened a lot this last year. There's been this undercurrent of anxiety and a lack of control or a lot of things. So it's human nature to grasp at what is closest. And then sometimes when that anxiety is displaced, then the reaction we're having to the thing right in front of us doesn't match the situation. And the people around us are like, what just happened there? Because they aren't seeing, okay, this is not about the word. This is about all of the things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely how I've been more aware of that the last like month and a half, trying to figure out like why I'm focusing on certain things. And then I realized, I can't control some of the bigger picture stuff. So I'm focusing on these smaller things. Well, last closeout piece, is really just where's the best way for people to follow you, connect with you, interact, any of those things. So
Um,
social websites, all the
right.
fun self promotion tags.
So I you can visit my website. It's my name, JoYLERE.com. I also do writing on Substack. So my name and Substack.com. I love having conversations with people on Twitter. I'm on Instagram and active on LinkedIn. So my Twitter and Instagram handles are my name, JoYLERE, and then my degree, PSYD. And on LinkedIn, I'm Joy Lere PsyD as well.
Very nice. Well, Dr. Lere, want to thank you so much for coming on. This was fantastic. I learned things, and then I also just pull out stuff that reaffirms my own consistent beliefs. Right? That's that's what I focus on. Yeah. A joke all aside, but this was really wonderful. I loved it. I'm looking forward to just seeing more and more of the work that you're putting out there and the impact you're having. And I'm sure the listeners of Framework and we got some good shout outs to some of our other Fin Twitter and financial services women, especially Dr. Chef Lauren too, mixed in here. So anyone else you need to shout out before we go? Is somebody going to be like, wait, you were on Framework and you didn't say hi to me? So
well, there are so many fabulous people out there. I will say this. I've really appreciated the work, and I'm really excited about the work Brian Portnoy is doing in the behavioral finance space. Brendan Fraser is doing some great work there. If you are not following him, pay attention to what he's doing. He's got some excellent content, and I also have been just so appreciative of just the incredible group of females that I've gotten the privilege of being a part of. So Shanna Sizzle, Tori Happy, you mentioned Sonia. I've got some fun stuff in the mix with Caitlin and with Shauna coming up. So again, this being in this space, in this community, it's, Twitter is a wild, weird place, but there are some really, really tremendous, wonderful, really kind people. So it's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, there are wonderful communities out there. The female community in this financial world is a really, really amazing group. And and I'm glad to have you part of it and really appreciate your time, thoughtfulness, energy, all of that here today and further and beyond. So looking forward to, staying connected and really appreciate you joining the Framework podcast here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing the mic with me, Jamie.